Hello and welcome to A Look Back with Dick Morris. I'm John Bachman. Today we travel back in history to a time when America was engulfed in a bloody civil war that pitted the North against the South. Amid a tumultuous backdrop, the smallest vote for a presidential candidate in history took place, but the outcome was never in doubt. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on the promise to preserve the Union, enforce the laws of the United States, and end secession. Dick Morris, political analyst and advisor to Bill Clinton, shows us how Lincoln rose from humble beginnings to become regarded as one of America's greatest heroes.
In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise that drew the line at the parallel of the southern boundary of Missouri all the way to the Pacific Ocean and divided slave from free territories. Then when all the new states came in after the Mexican War, they passed the Compromise of 1850 that brought California in as a free state, but set up a fugitive slave law that was very effective in returning fugitive slaves to the South. And it looked like civil war had been averted because the issues had basically been settled. The South had acquiesced in a majority non-slave Senate by not offsetting the admission of California by another state. And everything was fine. But then in 1854, Stephen A. Douglas, the leading Democrat from Illinois, senator, couldn't leave well enough alone, and he introduced the Kansas and Nebraska Act to deal with the Kansas and Nebraska territories that were both slated to come into the Union as non-slave territories. They were north of the 1850 line. And Douglas, who was trying to appeal to the South so he could get elected president, said we shouldn't have any arbitrary line. We should just have popular decision-making in each state, referendum of the people in the state. Of course, as Lincoln said, nobody would ask the slaves. They don't get to vote. It's just the whites as to whether they want to enslave the blacks or not. The problem was that it passed, and it upset the Missouri Compromise and the 1850 Compromise. And everybody began to pack Kansas. Nebraska, they kind of gave away as a free state. But everybody went to Kansas. You had abolitionists who mobilized and brought their whole families to Kansas. One of them was John Brown, later in John Brown's raid. The Southerners with their slaves all moved up into Kansas, and you had a real effort to pack the state. And what happened was that a majority of Kansas was in fact anti-slavery, but a rump government was organized in Lecompton, Kansas, that claimed to be the majority but wasn't, and wanted it to be admitted as a slave state. And a mini civil war broke out in Kansas with violence, with hundreds of casualties on each side, terrorist raids by the slave and the anti-slave forces on each other, and it was an absolute mess, and it really presaged the kind of violence that would happen in the Civil War. That prevailed during the administration of Franklin Pierce, who was president from 1853 to 1857. And when James Buchanan came into office as the 15th president of the United States, he was going to settle it all. And what he did was set in motion events that directly led to the Civil War.
And that was a fascinating look back at the road up to the Civil War. Up next, what the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott, and the Lincoln-Douglas debate meant to the war. The Fugitive Slave Act broke new ground and changed several laws that were in place for years before. Here's Dick Morris with more.
James Buchanan was elected president in 1856, took office in 57, and he deserves, hands down, the title of the worst president of the United States we've ever had. He was absolutely horrible. And the first thing he did when he came in was he got in touch, as he shouldn't have, with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, who was an appointee of President Jackson's, been on the court for a long time. And Taney was a Maryland slaveholder. And of the 9 judges on the court, 7 had slaves. And there was a decision working its way up to the court in the case of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave, and his owner took him into a free state. I think it was Illinois. And while he was in Illinois, he took the position that he was a free man, and he escaped and put a life together as a free person. Then under the Fugitive Slave Act, his former owners went up, captured him, and brought him back and said they had the right to enslave him. And the issue went to the Supreme Court. And the question was, if you are a slave in a state without slavery, can you be a slave or can you be a free person? And the Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott decision, absolutely made the Civil War a vital necessity, because they said a slave is property, just like a loaf of bread or a car, a horse. No, and they said, and this is a quote from the decision, a Negro has no rights which a white man is bound to honor. No rights at all. You can do whatever the hell you want. And it didn't matter if a state was slave or free. What that meant was that de facto we had nationwide slavery, because if Southerners moved into the North and brought their slaves with them, the people of the North could not decide that their state would be slave-free, because under Dred Scott, they had to go ahead and allow slavery when it was brought into the state. And Dred Scott further said that no territory could make slavery illegal when it was coming into the Union. So all of these compromises that have held things together for 30, 35 years suddenly went right out the window. And it posed the naked question, without any varnish at all, of was slavery right or wrong? Now, at the same time that this was happening, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed in 1850, was cutting deeply in these northern states. And there were many instances where Southerners would try to reclaim their fugitive slaves or get federal government officials to do so. And local mobs or sometimes local state governments would interpose themselves and try to stop them from taking the slaves back. And in 1858, it was Stephen Douglas, who was the author of the popular sovereignty doctrine that overturned everything, ran for re-election to the Senate from Illinois, and his opponent was Abraham Lincoln. And they began the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the key moment in those debates came at Freeport, Illinois, where Lincoln said to Douglas, "Isn't slavery morally wrong? How can you delegate the decision as to whether to adopt or not adopt slavery to a vote of the people, especially since the slaves aren't counted as people? Don't you believe that slavery is wrong and that the states have a right to keep slaves out of their state?" In other words, you for or against the Dred Scott decision. And Douglas, facing a pro-union, anti-slavery electorate in Illinois and needing to get reelected, said that he agreed that the Dred Scott decision was wrong, that he agreed that slavery was wrong. Well, what that did is it split the Democratic Party completely in half, because Douglas was going to run for president in 1860, and he had Southern and Northern support. That's why he adopted popular sovereignty. He could straddle the issue and say, I don't have a position, let it be voted on by the people. But after the Freeport debate, he couldn't do that anymore. And when Douglas was nominated for president in 1860, the South walked out of the Democratic Party and nominated a guy named Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president, and split the party in half. The question then was, who would the Republican Party nominate?
And that was an interesting look at what framed the Civil War in the U.S. When we return, Dick Morris tells us how exactly Abraham Lincoln got elected. Abraham Lincoln made history by abolishing slavery, but even before he was elected, Lincoln set another milestone. Dick Morris shares that story with us now.
With the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court and the Fugitive Slave Law passed by Congress in 1850, the North realized that it could not remain slave-free, that the South would not only extend slavery to new territories, but to the North as well. And that created a firestorm of opposition in the North. It came at about the same time there was a religious awakening in the United States, and what we would now call evangelical Protestantism was rising to the fore, and abolitionism rose with it, and the hatred of the Southern slave oligarchy intensified. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, probably the most widely read book in the world as a percentage of the population, probably before or since, also had a lot to do with that. So there was a strong anti-slavery move. Now, Lincoln had been attracted a lot of notice when in 1858 he had debated Stephen A. Douglas, the founder of popular sovereignty. And while he lost the election to Douglas, he really won it. He got more votes than Douglas did. It was just that the state legislature would decide who the senators were, and much of the legislature had already been elected. And among the new people, Lincoln had a majority, but among all of them, Douglas had the majority, so he kept his seat. But Lincoln got a lot of points for that race in Illinois. And then he was invited to Cooper Union in New York City to give a speech. It's a very famous place, still there, down around NYU. And he spoke to a packed house and was brilliant in that speech in laying out the case against slavery and the case against the South. Really brilliant in that, and people really noted him as a comer. But he still wasn't in the front rank of Republican candidates for 1860. He got his Illinois delegation to pledge to him as a favorite son, but nobody thought he was really going to win. The winner was going to be Seward, who was the senator and was the governor of New York, former senator and sitting governor. And Seward controlled the New York State delegation, which was very large. Illinois was much smaller back then, and was by far the favorite of the convention. But there were other favorite sons who controlled individual delegations. Salmon Chase, who later became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, controlled about half of the Ohio delegation. Montgomery Blair, who came from Missouri, but his father ran Maryland, controlled both of those state delegations. And there were a number of other smaller candidates who controlled different aspects of the convention. Well, on the first ballot, first of all, the convention was held in Chicago, which was a big, big victory for Lincoln because he was very popular there. And Chicago at that time was kind of a new city, and the Illinois, a new state, it was the West, and it was really significant that they held it there. On the first ballot, Seward had a majority of the delegates, but you needed 2/3 back then to win the nomination. And he kept creeping up trying to get 2/3, but he could never quite get there. And then Chase made a real run at it, but he'd antagonized so many people in Ohio, he was really acerbic SOB, that he didn't even get the full support of his own state delegation. Cameron, the favorite son of Pennsylvania, made a run for it, but he also fell short. So the convention was basically deadlocked. More than 1/3 of the delegates were scattered over these favorite sons, Lincoln, Chase, Cameron, and the rest, and Seward could not get the 2/3 majority he needed. So everybody was fretting about what to do, and Lincoln came to the fore. The crowds in the convention hall loved him. They were in Illinois. He got a great rep from the Cooper Union speech, and he was a moderate. Seward and Chase were very far over as abolitionists. Seward once referred to the North and the South as an irrepressible conflict, which basically meant that he felt civil war was inevitable. Lincoln didn't. But he wasn't a conservative like Montgomery Blair was, willing to compromise on new territories taking in slavery. So Lincoln was acceptable to everybody, not well known, and he got the nomination. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln had gotten Douglas to say slavery was wrong, the Dred Scott decision was wrong, and he would reverse it if he could if he were president. That made him anathema to the South. It helped Douglas keep his Senate seat in Illinois, which was a northern state, but the South would have nothing to do with him. So when the Democrats met for their convention, they nominated Douglas, and the South walked out and held their own convention and nominated Breckinridge, went on to be a Confederate general, who was Buchanan's vice president. And then there was a fourth party, the Union Party, that were basically the old Whig Party in the South, who favored keeping the Union, but were not strongly pro-slavery. And those three parties divided the vote among them, and Lincoln was the only candidate left standing. He won with only 40% of the vote, one of the smallest margins, if not the smallest margin, I think, in history. But because the Democrats split, he carried all of the northern states. And the Breckinridge carried all of the southern states. I think Douglas carried one or two states, and I think the Union Party maybe carried one state. But Lincoln was president.
Certainly an interesting turning point in history. Stay with us as Dick Morris dives into how Lincoln kept the border states in the Union. Lincoln knew that to win the war, he had to stop the populated states from leaving the Union. Dick Morris tells us how exactly that was accomplished.
After Lincoln was elected, the deep southern states, led by South Carolina, and including Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, basically decided to leave the Union, and one after another they did. They felt that it was impossible to live with Lincoln. Lincoln kept hoping that the mystic chords of memory, as he put it in his first inaugural address, would resurface and a unionist spirit would overtake the South. But it never really happened. The problem Lincoln faced was basically, on the one hand, to keep Virginia and Tennessee in the Union, and then on the other hand, to keep the northern slave states in the Union that had slavery but was still part of the North: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. These were crucial situations. The population of the North, minus those border slave states, was about 19 million. The population of the South, minus Virginia, was 4 million. That excludes 3 million slaves, 4 million free whites. Virginia had 1 million, so that was significant. And Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri together had 3 million. So if those states had all gone with the South, it would be 19 million against 8 or 9 million, a much fairer fight than the fight that eventuated ultimately of 22 million against 5 million. Lincoln first had to play to try to keep Virginia in the Union. And with Virginia, the issue was, would the North try to stop South Carolina from seceding? If the North was going to do that, Virginia was probably going to come in on the side of the South. If the North was going to let South Carolina secede, Virginia probably wouldn't and would stay in the Union. But Lincoln had no choice. The South went about seizing all federal installations in the South. The Union abandoned a bunch of the forts, particularly Charleston, but decided to make a stand at Fort Sumter that was also in the Charleston harbor. There was the other fort in Charleston they abandoned. But in Sumter, they decided to reinforce it and to try to hang on to it. And the South fired on Fort Sumter. Ultimately, it blocked the resupply of the fort, and the fort surrendered, and the Civil War started. Virginia then sided with the South. By the way, it's worth noting that there were 3 pockets of Unionist sentiment in the South that are still there. West Virginia, which seceded from Virginia to set up its own state and stay in the Union. Eastern Tennessee, around the Knoxville area, that historically always voted Republican because of that, and northern Alabama, which tried actually to secede from Alabama to stay in the Union. But the real problem Lincoln had on his hands was Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky. Well, Maryland was the most serious problem, because if Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded by Confederate states, and you couldn't keep it as the capital. So Washington pulled out all the stops to keep Maryland in the Union. There's no doubt that the people of Maryland wanted to secede, but Lincoln wouldn't let him. He marched the army into Baltimore and into Annapolis. He occupied the state legislature. He announced the repeal of the habeas corpus constitutional right, which meant that he could hold people indefinitely without trial and without any formal charges being brought, and basically assumed dictatorial powers in Maryland. When the legislature tried to meet to secede, the federal troops wouldn't let them do it. So Maryland stayed in the Union by hook or by crook. With Kentucky, it was very different. Kentucky voluntarily stayed in the Union. That was where Lincoln was from before he moved to Illinois when he was young. But Kentucky became the first battleground, and the South tried to move into Kentucky. Grant began his military career with stands at Fort Donelson, pushing back and stopping the Confederacy from taking Kentucky, and eventually pushed the South out of Kentucky. Missouri from day one was a wild slugfest between guerrilla bands of the North and the South, and ultimately the North won. But it was a very interesting thing here. The commander of the Northern armies was John Fremont, who had been the Republican nominee for president 4 years before, in 1856, at the founding of the Republican Party. And he was a strong anti-slavery guy. And after he conquered the Confederate forces in Missouri, he announced the freeing of all slaves in Missouri. Lincoln countermanded the order and said, no, we're not going to free the slaves. They're going to stay slaves in Missouri, because he was not willing to send a signal to Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky that this was a slavery crusade. So Lincoln was very clear at the very beginning that this was not a fight about slavery. In fact, he wrote a letter to Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, and he said, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I'd do it. If I could save the Union by leaving them all in slavery and freeing none of them, I'd do it. And if I could save the Union by keeping some free and some slave, I'd do it. That ultimately the only factor here was the preservation of the Union. And at the start of the Civil War, when the Northern armies were consisted of volunteers, young, fresh boys, eager to go out and fight for the Union, to preserve the only democracy on the face of the earth, it was always about preserving the Union, not about slavery.
And what would the events that framed the Civil War be without politics behind them? Stay tuned as Dick Morris tells us the story of how the South won the post-war spin. The North may have won the Civil War, but it was the South's interpretation of the events that stalled the Reconstruction effort. Dick Morris has more on the South's post-war spin.
Right after the Civil War was over, the South began a really aggressive campaign to propagandize the United States about the need for the Union to come back together, for us all to forgive each other and to come back and be one country again. And in the course of that, to throw blacks under the bus and not focus very much on the civil rights issue. And part of that was the Ku Klux Klan terrorizing the South, but part of it was an entirely new spin on Reconstruction, in which the Northerners that tried to protect the black population from the Ku Klux Klan were seen as interlopers, carpetbaggers, because they would come down south and carpet bags and move down there and work as civil rights workers. We assumed that carpetbaggers were all people trying to get rich quick. Most of them were not. They were sort of the modern equivalent of social workers or even missionaries going south to try to help blacks regain their civil rights. Most of them were abolitionists who saw this as the next step in their calling. Scalawags were Southerners who cooperated with the Northern forces after the Civil War and were seen as traitors by the Klansmen and the racists of the South. And then came the coup de grace, the movie Gone with the Wind, which was really, for the South, post-Civil War, what Uncle Tom's Cabin was for the abolitionist side pre-Civil War. It really was a retroactive cleansing of slavery, where the slave is this dutiful, wonderful woman who is really more mother and nanny to the children, and they're all cheerful slave hands, and there are no beatings or whippings and no rape and none of that, and the field hand and the overseers are all nice, genteel people. That was the spin on slavery that the South put on it, the patina on it, after the Civil War was over. And it coincided with an entire generation of education that painted the Grant administration in uniformly negative terms, that hailed Woodrow Wilson, despite an inveterate Southern racism, as being an apostle of democracy and freedom, and really turned things completely backwards. And all of a sudden, those who insisted on civil rights were the radical Republicans, deviants, Thaddeus Stevens, evil men, extremists bent on punishing the South. And it really was quite remarkable how the South was able to change history. The reason this is important to me is that I was educated in the public schools of the 1950s and the 60s and the colleges of the 60s. And at that time, we all still believed that spin. And I learned history that way. And it's only through the more recent works of the historian Eric Foner, F-O-N-E-R, that we've really come to understand how vicious the Southern approach was in Reconstruction and how well-intentioned the Northerners largely were in the way they administered it. So think back over your history and read some of Foner's work, and you'll see the point that I'm making.
When we return, Dick Morris shares a very interesting perspective on how Democratic generals undermined Lincoln during the war. Well, there were two types of generals working with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. Dick Morris tells us why some were successful and others were not.
Now, in 1862, in the early part of 1863, things went terribly for the North. Loss after loss, defeat after defeat. And the Army of the Potomac, which was the main army outside of Washington, went through a whole series of commanders who were either inept and incompetent, like Hooker, or just refused to move and were too timid, like McClellan. In the West, Grant spearheaded a drive down through Kentucky into Tennessee and really made significant progress and fought a much more aggressive war. Histories all teach that. But what they leave out is the reason why some generals were passive and the others were aggressive. And the reason is that there were generals from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party. The Democratic generals did not go along with secession. They wanted the United States to remain united. But they were not all about wanting to destroy slavery, or the slave power, or the Southern aristocracy, or the plantation society. So when they invaded the South, they walked on eggshells. They didn't confiscate food from anybody. They didn't burn anything. The homes were left as they found them. I mean, there were soldiers. There was some craziness going on, but basically there was a great deal of discipline. And then when the rebel cavalry would cut the rail line that was reinforcing the Union troops, they would very politely pull back, repair the line, and then go back on the attack, not wanting to plunder the countryside they were traveling through, because they wanted to restore the Union as it was. That's the phrase that they used. But the Republican generals, the newer generals that came along, saw the Civil War not just as an effort to preserve the Union, but to change the Union to eliminate the power of the Southern slaveocracy, the Southern plantation owners who perpetuated the slave system and tried to maintain an iron grip on the federal government to perpetuate their power in the institution. And they had a very populist aversion to that, that not only combined the demand for political freedom, but also had a sort of class warfare component of it, of attacking the slave oligarchy. And these people, these generals, the Republican generals, were determined to break the power of the slave power that they thought ran the country, and they were right. And they didn't care. Not only didn't they care, it was a goal when they invaded the South to destroy it economically. Their goal was to live off the land, dismantle these plantation owners, liberate the slaves, burn them down, and basically break the power of the slave owners by disrupting and destroying the plantation system upon which they were based. So they didn't need supply lines. They didn't give a darn if the rail line was cut. They would just plunder from the countryside, not simply as an act of indiscipline, but because it was part and parcel of their war goals. And that led eventually to Sherman's famous March to the Sea, where he carved a 50-mile wide swath through Georgia, literally transforming the breadbasket of the Confederacy into an absolute wasteland. So it's important to understand that the transition from McClellan to Grant that took place in the Civil War and Union generals was not just a competent guy versus an incompetent. There was a political text to it, a Republican who was going to destroy the South versus a Democrat who wanted to preserve it at the same time that he conquered it.
Such a fascinating time in our history. And when we come right back, Dick Morris takes us to the post-Civil War Reconstruction period in America. The Reconstruction effort was for the southern states to rejoin the Union. Dick Morris tells us why Lincoln felt that point was moot.
The South was completely destroyed after the Civil War. Literally 3/4 of its rail lines had been broken up. Not only broken up, Sherman's troops twisted the rail around trees so that they could never be used again. And it was just destroyed. 1/4 of its young male population was dead, and many more seriously wounded. So there was just no economic viability there. Now, Lincoln took the position during the Civil War that the states had never left the Union. His whole burden of his view was states could not leave the Union, and therefore there was no issue of their being readmitted. And he said if 10% of the voters in a state take an oath to the federal government and that they won't rebel anymore, then the state could be readmitted. And when Andrew Johnson took over after the assassination, he hewed to Lincoln's line. And a whole lot of states were readmitted to the Union. And they sent their old Confederate senators and congressmen. In fact, the vice president of the Confederacy was seated as a member of the U.S. Senate from Georgia. And that absolutely drove the Republicans crazy. What did we fought this war for? Absolutely nothing. And in 1866, in the election, the Republicans got huge majorities in both the House and the Senate. But it also led to Congress completely taking over the process of Reconstruction. And it said that unless you brought states back into the Union, where the only people who could vote would be people who took an oath not to rebel, and in which blacks had the right to vote and suffrage was universal, you couldn't come back into the Union. That triggered a major Southern upheaval by the white community and led to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist groups that sought to fight back against those rules. Well, one of the problems Congress had is that after they abolished slavery, the slaves were in the South, but they weren't permitted to vote. And the Constitution provides that every white person is counted as one person, but every slave is counted as 5/8 of a person. And that meant that the Southern delegations in Congress under slavery were very much larger than they should be, because the blacks who were slaves were counted 5/8 of a person each. Well, what Congress did was to pass the 14th Amendment, which first of all opposed the black codes and the segregation and the stuff that the states were saying. It essentially applied the Bill of Rights to the states, requiring that everybody be made a citizen if they were born or naturalized in the U.S., and that nobody be denied protection, equal protection of the laws, and you can't take life, liberty, or property, the phrases that are very well known in the 14th Amendment, our most famous amendment. But it also provided that the southern states had a choice. If they didn't let the blacks vote, the blacks wouldn't be counted in their representation. And if they did, the blacks would be counted, but as one full person. And that was their solution to this suffrage problem. It didn't work because the southern states claimed the blacks could vote, and in fact none of them did because they were barred. And that led to the 15th Amendment, which explicitly conferred the right to vote on the black community. And that was ratified in 1870. But in the meantime, the Reconstruction was proceeding vigorously. There were 1,500 black elected officials in the South. A lot of Unionist Southerners came forth and cooperated with these governments. They were called scalawags, as they put down by the white Southerners. Northerners came down to the South to try to help set up these governments, usually members of abolition societies. They were called carpetbaggers by the Southerners because the bags they carried were often made out of carpets. And there was a real attempt to get the black community and the South as a whole back on its feet. But then Johnson and the Congress made a fatal decision. They had set up something called the Freedmen's Bureau, which would help slaves reintegrate into society. And originally, the focus of it was economic, giving every slave 40 acres of land. The Union, the government, had amassed a huge amount of property by confiscating the estates of Southern rebels. And now it was going to chop it up and give it to their slaves, 40 acres and a mule to each slave. But the Congress and Johnson stopped that. They wouldn't go ahead with that, and instead they focused on trying to give the blacks political rights. They reasoned that if the blacks could vote, they could get their economic rights too. Horrible decision, because what happened was all of the former slaves became sharecroppers, where essentially it was a feudalist system, and whereas it wasn't slavery, it was feudalism. And they had no power. They were controlled by the white plantation owners and their employers, and the Freedmen's Bureau eventually went out of business. In the meantime, there was a constant fight between Johnson, who was basically pro-Southern and himself a Southerner, and the Congress, which wanted a radical Reconstruction. They were called Radical Republicans. Then, in 1868, Grant became president, and he, of course, was a radical Republican.
And thank you for tuning in to a look back with Dick Morris. In future segments, we'll talk about civil rights and the scandals under the Grant administration. I'm John Bachman.